Hi, everybody. I'm Malik Pancholi. I am the chair and co-founder of Act to Change, and I'm excited to welcome you to our first Leadership Convo. It is 2021, and in just 23 days, so much has happened while we are still in the middle of battling a pandemic. This week, we honored Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights legacy, and history was made as Kamala Harris became the first female, Black, and South Asian American vice president in the White House. Her inauguration was a celebration of how we can all embrace our own intersectional identities. Her historic election also sparked many critical discussions within AAPI families about our own implicit anti-Blackness. At Act to Change, as we work to end bullying, we know that we are always stronger when our communities band together. And that's what we are here to talk about today. Now, before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we are meeting on today. While we are coming together on a virtual platform, we acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave for other lands. Let us also remember that Indigenous peoples are not a people of the past, but are here with us now. If there are Indigenous people watching today, you are invited to share your tribe in the chat, and welcome. Thank you. All right, let's get started. I am so lucky to have with me fellow actor and activist Ryan Alexander Holmes as a co-moderator. Ryan, welcome.
Hello, what's up? What's up,
How
Malik?
are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be here, man. And let me introduce myself for people who don't know who I am. My name is Ryan Alexander Holmes. I'm an actor, activist, Afro-Asian American. My mother's Chinese. My father is African American. I'm very active on the social medias where I make original content on social issues focusing on identity and culture. And I use humor to get the message across because I really do believe that laughter is universal. And my mission is to normalize these conversations like the one we're about to have. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
I am so happy that you are here too. And also I just want to say, for those of you who are not following Ryan, what is your handle on social media, Ryan?
It's Ryan Alex H.
Ryan Alex H. You have to check out his videos because everything that he said is exactly right. He's talking about such important stuff, but using an accessible medium, comedy, which I'm also familiar with. So I'm really excited to get to share the stage with you today. We are also honored to be partnering with the Leadership Conference Education Fund's Black Justice is Our Justice campaign. We are launching a 2-part workshop series entitled Leadership Convos. This is the first part of that. It's about what it means to be a leader in our own families to combat anti-Blackness. So Ryan, can you, before we kick things off, tell us a little bit about why this particular conversation today is so important to you?
It's important to me because I really want the younger generation to understand what it truly means to see the entire humanity in another human being. And I think addressing and discussing anti-Blackness is absolutely necessary for that to happen. And we live in an extremely colorful world. And there's this idea that being colorblind will solve our issues, but no. We see in color, so we might as well see in color. I have beautiful almond toasted caramel skin. I would like people to see that because they have the ability to. So we can't ignore the colors that we can see. And I grew up in a Chinese community and did experience anti-Blackness from my own people, Chinese people. And it made me feel at times that I was a Chinese kid trapped in a Black kid's body or something like that. But I also felt the love from my own Chinese family and from many members of the Chinese community as well. So from an early age, I understood that anti-Blackness it didn't stem in reality. It stemmed from conditioning that's not based in reality. And it's conditioned into people by the system that we're living in. But times have changed, and we have a new vocabulary, and we have a heightened sense of awareness to combat the subconscious shadow beliefs that are formed in our, not just people who aren't Black in their minds, but also in people who are Black in their minds. You know, I was taught by my peers, because I was the only Black kid, how to act Black. And that is ridiculous. You know what I mean? That's ridiculous. So I think Act to Change, what you guys are doing and what we're doing here, is so important to that. And so I think the conversations need to be embedded in the system as well.
I'm so grateful for the way that you frame that, and also just what you said about the conversations being embedded in the system. Like I hope that what the product of today is that more people will go out and have conversations within their own families, within their own communities, and this is just a way to start that. So having you here to share your experience, and also an experience that I think many people will relate to, but also will be eye-opening to so many people, is a critical component of what we're trying to do here today. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
All right, so today we have several AAPI youth leaders who are going to be sharing their experiences about speaking with their parents and their loved ones about anti-Blackness. And then in next month, in part 2 of our series, we will have a complimentary conversation with AAPI parents and caregivers about how they talk about anti-Blackness, especially during Black History Month, with their children. Ryan, I just want to go ahead and hand the mic to you for a second.
Look, I just want to reiterate how grateful I am to be here, because as a kid, I didn't have this opportunity, right? There weren't places for me to go to talk about sort of the pain or the stress that I was going through. And I didn't even have sort of a vehicle and articulate how I felt. So I'm grateful for Act to Change for creating this space, because the system that we grow up in as AAPIs it's grossly inadequate in educating us about our own people, our own history, our own culture. So we have to form our own strong community bonds that show us how strong we truly are, and that assimilation isn't the only path to success. And I also want to say that I'm extremely grateful to my own parents, who taught me the strength of both my cultures at a very early age, while still battling the world around them and how the world perceived them, and the world wanted to put them in boxes, and their own families' views on their interracial marriage. So I think having these conversations can be extremely difficult, especially when it's with family, but we really need to get to the truth. And if we start these conversations and base them in truth, then the change will happen.
I think that is a perfect segue to get our panelists on, because I love that you thanked your parents and that they have their own cross-cultural identities and systems. And I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, is we are all facing these issues of implicit biases within ourselves, but also our own perspectives and all the things that we bring to the table. And so let's jump in. I do want to, before we invite the rest of the panel on, I do want to point to our audience to our Racism is a Virus toolkit. It's on our website, and it includes a section on navigating uncomfortable conversations with your parents about racism. Today, the conversation that we're going to have cannot possibly cover everything. It's not designed to cover everything. So this toolkit is a fantastic resource. And I actually think they're going to drop in a link to it as well into the chat. All right, so we are ready to introduce our panelists. We have with us today, we're so lucky to have with us today, one of the authors of the toolkit that I just mentioned. She co-wrote the Racism as a Virus toolkit as an Act to Change intern. And she's here with us today, Kathleen Malari. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen, she, hers, and I'm calling in from Yonkers, New York. And well, I'm a recent graduate from Cedar Crest College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Graduated literally class of 2020 back in May, cum laude with a BA in International Studies and concentrations in Religious Studies and Economics. But now, as a recent grad, very fortunate and blessed to found work at a local nonprofit in Manhattan called the Fresh Air Fund, where I'm working as their database associate. And well, I'm more than happy and very excited to be joining the Act to Change family once again, because I spoke before during the Youth Rising conference this past summer. And to just talk about a subject that's very near and dear to me, since I was one of the co-authors of the Racism is a Virus Toolkit. And well, again, I'm excited to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you. So you mentioned that you co-authored the Racism Virus Toolkit, and that this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. But is there something that particularly brought you here today to be a part of this panel?
Yeah, absolutely. Since part of the Youth Rising Conference, I was actually the one that talked about the segment about how to approach your family members about talking about anti-Blackness and racism. And while I went through that process this past fall, since coming back home from college, since graduating, I've had a little bit more time to talk to my family and spend more time with them. And with like the questions coming into this panel, I will be talking about it a little bit more later. But yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Nice to see you, Kathleen.
Nice to see you.
I want to introduce another guest, and his name is Neil.
Hello.
There he is. What's up, Neil? How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. My name is Neil Wasudev. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm an 8th grader at Carey Academy, and this is my first experience on Act to Change, so I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you, man. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. This is your first, but it definitely will not be your last. Thank you for joining the family, as it were. All right, we have our most youthful panelist, Hattie Watson. Hi, Hattie.
Hi, my name is Hattie Watson, she, her, and I'm 11. I was connected to Act to Change last year when my teacher, Miss Dash, applied for the Homeroom with Tam France, and I was asked to speak on the student panel representing my school, Kansas City Girls Preparatory Academy. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you for joining. And Hattie, you were also part of our Youth Rising event and blew all of us away. So thank you for coming back and joining us here at Act to Change. And last but not least, we have Saveri Nandigama. Saveri, hi.
Hi.
Can you give us a quick intro on who you are and what brought you here today?
Yeah, thank you all for having me. My name is Saveri, pronouns are she, hers. I'm a senior at the University of Michigan, GOLU, and I'm majoring in philosophy with a minor in religious studies. Outside of the classroom, I'm also the student body vice president, and I organize a lot within South Asian spaces and try to advocate for students of color whenever possible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. So let's just dive right in. Kathleen, I would love to start with you if that's okay. The toolkit talks about the model minority myth, which is something I think a lot of us have heard. Some of us might have ideas around what it is. Some of us might know it really well, and some of us might not know it at all. So can you define for our audience the concept of the model minority myth and how it perpetuates anti-Blackness in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd like to start with talking about racism first. So like racism, as we know it today, I believe is a product of colonialism. And I did a whole thesis on this before I graduated. And with that, I believe that racism is a byproduct of colonialism, of course. And this has allowed people to be more prone to internalizing a perception of themselves and others based on race and their proximity to whiteness, right? And we may even see this in our own families where, for example, dating outside of your race is unacceptable, especially if your partner so happens to be either Black or Latinx. Or even a step further, for our women in the audience and in this panel, perhaps the standard of beauty had to be one of fair and lovely skin, where our own skin didn't even escape that generational push to align ourselves with whiteness. But more on that later. And to answer your question about the model minority myth, and here I am as one of the authors of the toolkit, just shamelessly advertising. In our toolkit, we actually have a glossary at the end of it where we define the model minority myth as a term actually related to colorism with roots in anti-Blackness, right? And this model minority myth actually took hold in Asian communities, I believe, just after World War II, which painted Asian Americans, or APIs, as the hardworking, rule-following do-gooders of a minority group, right? So the coining of this term model minority then segues into how it perpetuates anti-Blackness. And I say this because modern minority, that coinage, assumes that there must be a problem minority, right? And so unfortunately, this has paved the way for a generation's worth of a perception that whatever discrimination or hardship that Black people might be facing is their own fault. And therefore, the model minority myth is inherently anti-Black and is upheld by a racist system and other racist institutions. Yeah.
I thought that was such an amazing, concise answer. I just want to also add to it that internally the model minority myth is so challenging for Asian Americans because it also supposes that all of us are, successful and have access to education and have been given opportunities in our life that is not actually true for the entire community of Asian Americans as a whole. So it's a pretty insidious concept, but it's also, like you said, Kathleen, and like you said so beautifully, so divisive in that it's literally designed by people in power to pit minorities against one another and try to hold certain people down. So thank you for that. Yeah.
And to add to that, being Black and Asian, I've experienced that and seen that yes, the model minority myth creates this. It's a myth. It creates this idea of the haves and the have-nots. So there's a whole subsect or a sect of the Asian community that is not seen. And being Blasian, I feel like I was a part of that because I followed the model minority guidelines to a T, yet I did not experience what the model minority myth granted to people. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But to segue, we're gonna go to our youngest panelists and ask them some questions. Hattie, a fellow mixed kid just like me. Can you tell us about your experience talking about anti-Blackness with your family, and how do you respond to questions your siblings have about what they hear and see in the media? I think you're muted. Hattie. I think you're muted, Hattie. I think you're muted again. Hattie, I think your mic is still muted.
I'm so sorry.
There we go. I can hear you.
I am biracial, and my extended family is all white except for my mom and one grandma. My granny was adopted from Korea when she was only a few days old, so our family doesn't always recognize us as Asian because she was raised in an all-white family in the South. I don't think my extended family always sees racism and anti-Blackness when it's not super obvious. So when it comes to these conversations, my proximity to whiteness means I can afford to not engage in these conversations. But I know that it's important for me to do this because while all people of color can experience racism, Black people experience structural and blatant racism in a uniquely deadly way.
Wow. I'm just so I'm just so happy to hear this generation, your generation, say those words, right? Because that wasn't even on the table when I was a kid. So I just have hope. I just have more hope than I did have before you answered that question. So thank you. And Neil, I wanted to go to you. Can you tell us about recent conversations you've had with your grandparents and how you prepared for them, and what you learned and how you felt afterwards?
Sure. So when I was preparing for these conversations with my grandparents, I did a little bit of research. I read some articles, and I watched one video in particular that really stood out to me. It was about an interracial marriage between an Indian man and an African American woman. And it really was inspiring to just see all the obstacles that they overcame and everything that they had just gone through. But moving on to the actual conversations, those were really positive experiences, and I really enjoyed talking to my grandparents. Some of my family members that I would talk to, they might start off by saying something that's a little bit more controversial, and such as some members of the African American community don't seek to find higher education, which I don't necessarily agree with. But as we kind of went more in depth and talked more about the why of this, they sort of softened their stance and evolved to be like much less judgmental. Sorry. Also, other family members that I talked to, they sort of just described how their opinions of the African American community sort of just developed over time.
Mm.
And they like just by themselves, how it just occurred naturally. And that was also really interesting to listen to. Also, towards like the end of these conversations, I talked with some of my grandparents about when they were first exposed to the African American community. And for some of them, that was when they immigrated to America and they had some good interactions with the African American community through work and jobs, and were actually employed by some of them in some scenarios. And others were actually born and raised in Kenya. So they just kind of saw these Kenyans as just as just normal and something that they just knew since they were born. So yeah, right. So these conversations really helped me understand my grandparents and get to know them and feel them a lot closer. And I feel like they felt the same way about me. And we like all acknowledge that members of the Indian or South Asian community and the African American community have a sense of solidarity towards each other. And one thing that was unanimous throughout all of the people that I interviewed is that they noticed that the members of the African American community were discriminated upon more than the South Asian community, which was something that I think should be noted.
Wow. Yeah, I think proximity is really important, right? Because when people are next to each other, they have to see each other and talk to each other, and therefore they see each other's humanity, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up and acknowledging too that these conversations are hard to have with your family, but when you have them from a place of love and understanding, right, you start to have conversations where they're questioning where these thoughts came from, right? So I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
Yeah, Severi, I want to bring you into the conversation, but I just had like a couple quick follow-up questions for Neil and Hattie, if that's okay. I'll try to make them quick, but Neil, what sparked you wanting to have these conversations in the first place with your grandparents, and what was the format of the conversation? Was it just sitting down and talking with them, or how did you structure that?
So I would just call up my grandparents through FaceTime, and I wrote down some questions just as like to make sure that the conversation didn't stop and go at like a standstill. But I found that once I asked one question, that it would really sort of just flow, and we didn't really need to move on to any other questions because they had so many stories and so much information that they hadn't even told, like my parents, for example, hadn't even known because they just were never asked about this. So I just think it needs to be known that some members of the elderly community have so much information that they just need to be asked about, and they're really insightful.
Yeah, what a beautiful way to put it. And why did you want to have these conversations in the first place? Like, what inspired you to put together a list of questions for the elderly people in your life?
Well, I had just realized that I had never really had any really true in-depth conversations with my grandparents or even just my family members where we sat down for a while and talked about what you thought and why you thought it.
I think that is so beautiful, and it's so interesting to hear that too, and also to hear these conversations happening across multiple generations. So thank you for sharing that. And Hattie, I wanted to ask you a quick question too. So you used a phrase that I think is so adult in a way. You know, you said my proximity to whiteness, which is such an interesting phrase, and I actually think that a lot of us have experienced that on some level. It certainly relates to what Kathleen was talking about with the model minority myth, that certain races or have a closer proximity to whiteness than others, at least the way that we are viewed by other people. And I'm just curious, how did you first become aware of that, or how did you even learn this language to even speak about your own experience in this way?
So in my family, specifically with my mom, I talk a lot about racial injustices in my community and my own identity. And I am kind of expected at home to have a higher level of conversation with my family. Like it's not, and it's a little stressful sometimes, but I really enjoy it because I get to have very high level conversations with my parents. So I think where I first learned this sort of this language is that I just was talking with my parents, and they always kind of help me understand, and they explain things to me. So I've definitely gotten a lot of help from them understanding my own identity.
That's fantastic. I mean, such a model for both of you, Neil and Hattie. And Kathleen, you talked about this too, about being back at home and talking with your family, like just how these conversations can be had, and they can be had in so many different formats. I mean, you can do an interview and call your grandparents up on FaceTime, or you can just sit around with them and talk to them, or you can move back home and suddenly be forced to have difficult conversations. I love all of this. Severi, I want to bring you in too. So you're in college. Yes. What an interesting, crazy time to be in school. Are you virtual or are you in classes?
I've been virtual since the pandemic started. So since my 21st birthday, actually, which was the first day of lockdown.
Oh my gosh, I'm sure that was a fun party of one. So let me ask you, as a college student, what did the Black Lives Matter protests mean to you? How, like, being in school virtually, like, was there a component of this being on campus, off campus? And then I guess, coupled with that, how did you talk about that with your own parents?
Yeah, I think, so there are two James Baldwin quotes that I came across actually during MLK Day celebrations at my school. One is, Black people have pledged allegiance to a flag in a country that has never pledged allegiance to them. And I think that really encapsulates the idea behind the movement for Black lives. It's unfair to live as a person in a society that capitalizes on other people who have so fervently said, like, enough is enough, please help us. And so I think that was, I guess, a quote that really stood out to me. And another thing James Baldwin actually also said, and this is paraphrased, is, if you're relatively conscious in this world, you should be furious all the time. And so Black Lives Matter really made me furious and made a lot of people furious. But I think one thing I've seen on and off campus is it's so easy now, especially with everything being online, to just repost a story and call yourself a social justice advocate. And so it's been trying to have these difficult conversations, and especially with my parents and my family, you don't want to channel the rage you have about the world into that conversation, especially with Asian parents. That just will not go over well. And so it's really important for me to ask them, like Neil said, about their experiences and kind of show them that they've even had to have these tough conversations before. And it's just, how do we make sure we're continuously having these conversations and making sure that we're all trying to strive to a better and more just world? So that's what the past year of my life has looked like.
Wow. And yeah, go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
I want to focus on that James Baldwin quote of pledging allegiance. Black people have to pledge allegiance to a flag that doesn't pledge allegiance to them. And the rage that you talked about, because I've experienced that, right? The George Floyd, watching that George Floyd tape, it was different than a lot of other tapes that I've seen, because it was just blatantly obvious, and you could not disregard it whatsoever. And you understood the implications of it. And it sent me into a rage that I brought to my family, to my parents. And, my dad was a Black Panther, so he was able to channel that rage into something that wouldn't have me go into the streets and, be harmed or do something that would jeopardize my future or my physical health or mental health. That's all I wanted to say, was that I feel grateful that other people are having these same conversations and these same feelings, because a lot of the time I just feel, as a Black man, we are isolated and we can't talk about these things, because we appear as weak. So that's that. I just wanted to say that I love those observations that you were talking about.
Yeah, and really quickly, if I can just say, I think another thing I've been talking to my parents about is like, why do we have to see such a vivid representation of Black people suffering in order for us to feel something? Like, we should, if someone says like, hey, this is racism, we should immediately be like, I know what that feels like, and this is not Oppression Olympics. I need to help, like, someone who's asking for help. And so I think that's something else that I've been feeling particularly furious about, and I kind of wanted to share that as well.
I'm so glad you did. I also, I feel like growing up for me, there's also been a sense in disparate communities of this idea of like, even though I've experienced what you've experienced, we're all scraping for the bottom of the barrel, so I can't help you. And I think what we have come to learn, and maybe the hard way, is that actually when communities of color come together, we are all better off for it. But there's a journey to that, obviously. And I think I'm hearing it in what everyone's talking about here, that it has not always existed, especially between the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and the Black communities in America. So very, when you were having conversations with your parents, did you run into any language barriers, any difficulty explaining concepts? I think there's some words out there that I think are trigger words for people, or really upset people, like white supremacy. Even telling someone they might have privilege, I think, can sometimes be a challenging thing to say. Systemic racism, I know, is something that people are very divided on, like what that even means, and obviously it's like these are really big concepts. Did you have any challenges around that, or how did that go for you?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I had to snap myself into realizing is that, like, I'm Indian, and so in India everybody is brown, and in South Asia most of the time everybody is brown too. And so my parents are coming from this place where everybody is the same quote unquote race, and then coming here where there are now different races, and as a result there are different ideas of social power. And so I couldn't start with like, this is what white supremacy is. I had to start with, the microaggressions that we've all faced. Like, my mom did her PhD here, and her thesis advisor could not pronounce her name for the life of him. He just could not. And so I like trying to show her, you don't need to live in a world where people just can't pronounce your name. Like, you deserve a right to have your name be pronounced correctly. And so it's things like that, and like working your way up to recognizing what white supremacy is as a whole. It's a journey, but that's what I've found most helpful in my conversations with my parents.
I appreciate you being so honest about that too. Yeah, I think touching, Ryan, you talked about this a little bit too, but touching on those things that we can relate to, like you talked about watching that video. I don't know what everyone experienced that like. I can't speak to that, but I know for me, like, you watch that and you're like, oh my gosh, like it's a crime against humanity. It's like we all fear for our lives when we watch something like that happen. I think bringing it back to the personal is always really helpful, I think, in trying to have these conversations. Kathleen, we haven't forgotten about you. Hi. You're also a recent college graduate, as you mentioned. So congratulations, by the way. Welcome to the world of being an adult. We've all been there, when our aunties or our uncles make a comment, and you brought this up in your intro about lighter skin tone, or being better than darker skin tone, or those offhanded comments are like, oh, we don't go to that neighborhood. That neighborhood's not for us. Those kinds of conversations. So how do you maintain a sense of respecting your elders while also challenging their misconceptions around the Black community? And especially, as a young adult, how has that shifted for you from maybe when you were younger?
The respecting your elders really resonated with me, because as the firstborn and only daughter of like immigrant Filipino parents, that's all I heard growing up. Like, I grew up not knowing if one culture, Filipino or American, should take precedent over the other. And I didn't even know how to balance the both, because being like the only daughter, the firstborn of like immigrant parents, it's like I feels like I have to upkeep the culture that they left behind to come here to America. So that's why respecting your elders, aka respecting your culture and all of the things that come with it, was like the motto my parents told me while growing up. And I was fairly defiant with my own attitudes and perceptions of the world in high school. But right now, I have more tact than I had then when I was in high school. And well, I found now being at home and like being not forced, but being in a position where I have to see my family more than I did back when I lived on campus for the past 4 years, where I found out there was more opportunity to talk to my parents and my grandmother about the woes of the model minority myth and how our worth should not be tied to our proximity to whiteness, and that skin creams and our accents should not and does not erase the reality that we are not white, right? And they became more open to listening when I started to understand that they are in a very difficult position to renew and reshape the perspectives that they grew up with. I mean, they came from the Philippines, they immigrated here when they were in their early 20s. They had very different cultural values, and the mentality that they had to uproot themselves from their childhood homes to make it here and fit in and assimilate to life here in the US pretty much was the narrative of most of their life. There was that narratives of survival to make sure that our family was taken care of in all means possible. So the concepts and the ideas and just the news about racism and like the discrimination practices of like minority groups here in the US, they may have felt it themselves, but thought that on the ladder of what was more important, that wasn't one of them. So I felt they had like the blinders on for most of their life until I went to college and started talking to them about these things. And the more that I talked about them, and I'm very, very happy to hear that my peers here on this panel decided to open up the conversations with questions that were never posed to their family members before. Because a lot of us like to assume that, oh no, there's the news here, like it's on everyday news, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they might be absorbing it in the way that we think they should be, or like we live our daily lives as their children or as their grandchildren, but little do we realize that, oh, I don't really know that much of my family's like migrant histories when they came here to the US, or even before they were here in the US. So when Nia was talking about how he asked his grandparents questions that they never had been asked before, it opened up a whole slew of information that he wouldn't have otherwise known, made me so happy, because in a previous event here for Act to Change, I talk about how being open and creating that safe space with your family members. And for me, that's after dinner, after a glass of wine and watching Filipino news is for my family, right? Everyone's they're a little like more calm and is more willing to talk, and just seeing the realities of things on Filipino news. And if everyone's seen Filipino news, it's they just show everything there. And well, that is my open and entry point with having these conversations with my families. And it might be different for other people in the audience, and in all honesty, like you have to catch them when they're in the mood, right? And what do you call it? Like the comments are funny. I'm sorry. But anyway, it's like on an underlying thread that I had noticed between Neil, Hattie's, and Severi's experiences with their own families is that then you need to ask these questions to understand what your families and your parents are going through, because otherwise you wouldn't know that bridge that would open up this history of this knowledge of your own family that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to take into consideration while you're trying to hold your fury about everything about the institutional racism. But you need to meet your family where they know where they are at. So that's essentially where I've been trying to get at the past few months with my family, and with the inauguration and with the impeachment of Trump the second time. I've been like the go-to informant of my family. And honestly, I found more progress by keeping quiet and then having be curious about what's happening, and they come to me now rather than me storming down their bedroom door, say, hey, have you seen what's happened? Do you know what this means? Do you understand? As opposed to like that. So to Saveri's point, don't be don't impose your anger on the world onto your poor parents or grandparents who just don't know any better yet.
I love that you bring up respect for elders, because that has been something that I've lived my life by, and I think everyone should, but it shouldn't negate you being able to have these conversations, right?
Exactly.
It can cause a atmosphere of being afraid to have the conversation, because it's like, what are you saying to me? Do you not respect me? It's like, no, I'm just trying to have a conversation. Just trying to have a conversation. I also think culture is such an important lens, and we're in an Asian space here. And I think about, my mother's an immigrant and my grandparents were immigrants to this country. They're coming from a completely different society with different rules, right? That are based in a rich history of honor and respect. And they come to America and they're met with, xenophobia and racism. And I think a lot of Asian immigrants found a way or a manner in which to succeed. And stereotypically that's been perceived as, putting your head down, being quiet. But really it's just, we see what's happening here. We don't want to stoop to the disrespect that we feel. We want to find our own path, and we'll do it on our own, and we'll do it in our own way, And I think for me to have the empathy to understand what they're going through. And in a lot of Asian households, we're not having these conversations, right? Mm-hmm. They're not telling us the heartache that they went through because they don't want us to experience it. Somebody else already experienced it. Why should I have my offspring experience it? I want to put them in a place where they don't even have to think about that, And that's where a lot of these Asian parents are coming from. And so this is a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask Hattie and Neil about something that's very relevant to what I just said. But Hattie, I wanted to ask you, what is one piece of advice you have for someone who's nervous about starting a conversation with relatives or their parents about anti-Blackness or racism?
I would say to use the current events or an existing conversation to notice and point out things from a racial equity perspective. So if someone mentioned how surprised or upset they were about police brutality, you might mention that this isn't new and that it's been ongoing because of systemic racism, not just individuals' bad behaviors. And I would say also not to expect to close the knowledge gap in one conversation, because that's just unrealistic.
That's
yeah, Jesus. I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad she said that, because Hattie, my gosh, I think sometimes there's this feeling like I've gotta convince this other person immediately. We're all laughing because what you said is it's so mind blowing and yet so simple. Is you gotta just start the conversation. You can't expect to change the world in one single conversation. So yeah, amazing.
Oh my God, that is on. I'm taking that, because sometimes you just want to save the world by changing this one person's mind, but you can't change anyone's mind. You can inspire them to change. And so it's a patient process, and it's here are the facts. Would you like it in a humorous form? Here you go. I can do that too. Here you go. So it's a long game, but it's also a game of understanding and compassion for having the empathy to understand that they're at a different level. So thank you, Hattie. God, you're teaching me so much. I wanted to ask Neil. Neil, I wanted to ask you the same question. I'll repeat it. What is one piece of advice you have for someone who is nervous about starting an honest conversation with relatives or parents about anti-Blackness or racism?
Right. So first of all, I would just tell that person to just relax, because since it is your family member, no matter what you have to say, it won't change how they see you in any way. Second of all is just a simple strategy, and that is to kind of don't start the conversation by putting something controversial right on the table. I would say kind of have them open up a little bit and then sort of bring it in, but make sure not to forget about it. I would also say that which is probably this is probably one of the most important things that I've learned through this journey, is that kind of have your family member who or that you're talking with tell like personal stories with one-on-one interactions with a friend or who is part of the African American community, because once you start seeing the African American community as less of a group and more of individual people, or with more individual like traits and thoughts, then you kind of, it really changes your perspective, and you become a lot less judgmental. And I just think that all of, especially with the elderly folks, I think that they have so many stories that can be brought to the table and can sort of just, that many people haven't even heard from um, 30 or 40 years ago, that really just help move the conversation, and they're just really insightful. So I really enjoy listening to those.
Yeah. God, what you said about not starting with something that's controversial, right? That's really important because sometimes you can come into a situation, like Hattie said, not everyone's at the same place. You can come into a situation with something very controversial, which is biased in the sense that it is taking a side, even though you know there's a right side. You're not coming from an indifferent, empathetic place for that person. So that is extremely important. Another thing too is speaking one-on-one to people as humans, right? To get to know that person, not based on their race and all the baggage and stereotypical conditioning that you have in your own mind, to ask them, but actually coming to them as a human being. So, yeah.
Yeah, Neil, there was another thing that you said that I just want to highlight. You talked about ask them to relate stories of their own experiences with other people, which Ryan just touched on too. But the idea of like humanizing someone who you might see as other, I think is really important. I think it so ties into what we're trying to do at Act to Change, and we always encourage young people to tell their stories, because if you don't tell your story, then no one's gonna ever know you, you know. And what happens, I feel like, when we tell our specific stories, is we realize that we all have these universal things about us. You know, we all feel pain, and we all have dreams, and we all have hopes, and we all feel love. And then we're all just human beings on this, as you said, Neil, on this journey together. And that, I think that creates empathy. It builds bridges between people instead of building divides. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, is to always bring it back to that human experience. Like, you know, somebody who you care about. So why would you demonize an entire race, you know?
I wanted to piggyback off of what you just said. It's man, it's really important to share your story, right? Because I think what the conditioning of the system can do is to make you think that you are the other, therefore no one can relate to your story because it's so specific and it's non-stereotypical, right? But what I'm starting to learn by creating my own content and really sharing my inner identity issues is that, like, it's not just synonymous with people who are Black and Asian. People of every mix reach out and say, I can relate to this, you know, and people who aren't even mixed, who have been in similar situations of feeling otherized, you know. So I encourage everybody to share their story, because that is really what is going to connect us and make us all feel like, oh, all these thoughts that we think that make us different, and we eat this different food and we do this and we think, it's not, it's real, it's culture, and we respect that, but it doesn't make us different in the way that we think it does.
Yeah. So Saveri, I wanna get you back in here as well. Let's look a little to the future. And I know that you in particular are considering law school, and that you want to work in civil rights, which we're all super, super excited about and can't wait to support you in that. What does the idea of being an active accomplice mean to you, and particularly in standing in solidarity with the Black community now and moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, first, I just want to say, Hattie and Neil, I'm like, my jaw is on the floor. Every time you speak, I'm like, oh, yes. But to your question, I think, you know, allyship is a muscle, and we constantly have to work it out if we want it to be the muscle we want it to be, which is being a true ally and in support of Black people and every community in America. And so that starts with reading materials, you know, especially in the summer, we saw a lot of people saying like, what can I do to their Black friends? And there's a plethora of literature out there for you to read. And that's what you need to do. You can't ask people who are in your life what they can do better, because then it's like, again, you're othering the person and saying, you're objectifying them basically. And so it's reading, and it's constantly asking yourself, you know, am I being an ally in this situation? And it doesn't matter if it's including someone in a conversation or in your friend group or calling someone in class. Like, you really need to think about your internal biases and break them down. And that is a lot of internal work, and that shouldn't and doesn't get publicized enough. But in order to be an active ally, it really is constantly unlearning your own biases. And that also, especially as Asians, like, that's not us letting go of our culture as we become more American. It's rather accommodating to a more globalized society. Because if you go back to your home countries, you're going to see a much more diverse population because people are coming there for work and things like that. So it's just accommodating yourself to changing times as opposed to letting go of your culture.
Yeah, I wanted to say that there's this there's this notion out there that multiculturalism is the end of, you know, nations, when in reality it's the absence of it's the fight against multiculturalism, and it's xenophobia and it's racism that is the end of nations. So I love the idea of like, we can all be ourselves and contribute to this globalized idea of nations and be all better off. And that's the idea that we need to accept, because that's where we're going.
Yeah. And so you know, there's something that you said in there about, you know, looking to, like, people looking at their Black friend and saying, what should I do? What should I do? And just like, I've heard this in so many things that people have said today about bringing it back to the personal and the thing that you can relate to. And I think I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but I certainly have, you know, as sometimes the only Asian American in a room, had that thing. And this is a very subtle way this plays out. And I don't mean to equate this to, you know, to racial injustice, but to have someone say like, well, I don't know, how does this Indian food taste, or whatever, like, or how do you say this word? And you're the only person in the room, and suddenly you have to speak for a whole culture, a whole history, and the pressure of that. And, you know, I've heard from so many Black friends during this time about how when you ask someone to talk about the trauma of their history, you're making them relive that trauma so that you can educate yourself. When it's like, what you said is so right. Go out there and do the homework yourself. You know, go out. If you are interested in this matter, there's so much literature. There's so many resources available. So part of, I think, what we have to do as leaders in this movement for racial justice is take the time to educate ourselves. That is part of the way we can move society forward. We're nearing to the final few minutes, and I want to hear from everybody really quickly again. I just want to share one little thing of my own. And you know, this conversation was about talking with our parents and how to address anti-Blackness. And I was thinking about that today before this call. But then I also I kind of wanted to bring up something separate. And I think what that is for me is, I feel like all of you have presented today a moment of courage, a moment of talking about something that could have been challenging, but you decided to do it anyway. And I just wanted to acknowledge that these conversations with families, with parents, you know, Anil, you talked about how they're a family member, like, you know, they're going to be there for you anyway. But I also think that sometimes talking to the people that we are closest to can sometimes feel the scariest too. And I bring this up to say that when we posted about this conversation on the Act to Change social media pages, I saw a lot of really hurtful comments being posted. I think there are people who are really threatened about the idea that racism is a concept, that it exists in this country, and that we need to eradicate it and we need to talk about it. And it's very easy, I think, you know, in online modalities where people don't even see you, to say awful things, to say horrific things. But there is still also like a courage in putting out the information we are putting out on social media. And so I just bring that up to say, there will always be those people who it's going to be very, 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 very difficult to have conversations with, and who will meet you with hate. And having that happen in person can feel very scary. So I just want to acknowledge the courage that all of you have displayed, and for all the young people and adults who are tuning in today, who tuned in because they want to know how to have these conversations. I just want to acknowledge that even just showing up sometimes takes an amount of courage, and I thank you for it. So I just want to bring that up. And then Ryan, I was wondering if you might lead us in a special way to begin to close out today's conversation.
I don't want to close. I don't want to close.
We're not doing it.
I want to talk forever. Okay, yeah, I will. So, yeah, we'd like to close our conversation today with a witness round. It's an age-old practice with indigenous roots that acknowledge everyone's presence in the gathering. And in a witness round, everyone will say one word, just one word, only one word, that they heard in today's conversation that resonated with them. And it's just one word. Okay, just one word. But let's start with Severi.
Solidarity.
Kathleen?
Stories.
Neil?
Bonds.
Hattie?
Humanity.
Malik?
Listen.
That's my turn. Colorful?
I love that. I love that so much. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We know that this is just the start of many conversations that we will all have with our loved ones. If language is a barrier in talking to your families, please check out Dear Asian Americans Instagram for their Letter for Black Lives series, which is read in many Asian languages. I want to thank our partner at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. Remember that Leadership Convos Part 2 will be in February. We will talk to AAPI parents and caregivers about how they discuss anti-Blackness and Black History Month with their children. You can get information on our social media. I want to thank all of the organizations that help promote and live stream, including Teach for America, Hate is a Virus, Yum Yum F, Asian American News, Angry Asian Man, Stage 13, Family Style, Cape, I Am Not a Virus, Tan France, Celia Au, and Helen Zia, and to our Act to Change team who worked so hard to put all of these together. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This would never happen without all of you. We also value your feedback, all of you who are watching today, so be sure to complete a quick evaluation survey that we will share in a follow-up email to those of you who registered. Yes, Ryan, take it away.
I want to say thank you to you, Malik.
Oh my gosh.
You said thank you to all those people, but I need to say thank you to you. So thank you. Thank you for being an inspiration to me too as an actor. I appreciate that. So yeah. Also thank you to all the people that you listed. You said them all.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I want to tell everyone out there too that they can visit acttochange.org and take the pledge to stand up to bullying. Please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're on TikTok. Help amplify the message, celebrate diversity. As a nonprofit, our work is not possible without your contribution. So if you're able to support, you can make a tax-deductible donation to acttochange.org. Please check out our solidarity resources for a list of organizations on the front lines of racial and social justice work that you can also support. We are also still accepting submissions for our Kindness Heals art exhibition. Submit your artwork about rising up to adversity and spreading love and kindness. Check out our website, acttochange.org, and our social media for details. And now, Ryan, I'm going to say thank you to you because you are an inspiration to me as well. I'm so grateful that you're here today, and it was also really, really fun to get to do this with you. So thank you for everything.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank all of our panelists. Let's bring them back for a quick shout out. Kathleen, Neil, Hattie, Severi, you are all brilliant and inspirational, and the future is so much brighter with your faces in it. So thank you. Please follow. I'm not sure who here has social media channels. Raise your hand if you do have one. Do you guys want to shout out your social media handles so people know where to follow you? Ryan, you first.
Ryan Alex H. RyanAlexH.
Kathleen.
Kat24. KAAT24.
Severi.
Just Severi_N.
Awesome. Hattie and Neil, are you all on social media that we should follow you on? You have many years to stay away from it, and please stay away as long as you can. Thank you, everybody. And remember, Black justice is our justice. Black justice is immigrant justice. Black justice is Asian American justice. Together, we can end bullying and hate. Stay safe. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today. Goodbye.